We live in a time where AAA games are no longer just finished at launch. Instead, they launch broken, unpolished, with the excuse that, well, because it's a live service, we can eventually make it good. So it's okay to release products in a less than ideal state, in a state that doesn't justify people purchasing the game at full price, $60 or beyond. A game like Anthem is a prime example where the game ships so poorly, in such a poor state, that BioWare has been forced to go back to the drawing board, and now they're working on an overhaul. And along the way, the roadmap for the game got completely annihilated. They had to just scrap that completely. Plans were completely derailed because they couldn't work on content. They had to work on fixing the game. And another company that's been pretty guilty of this is Ubisoft, especially with their one of their latest releases, Ghost Recon Breakpoint, which is kind of seeing an Anthem-style overhaul or reworking. Ubisoft is kind of going full BioWare here after the disastrous launch of Ghost Recon Breakpoint and after poor sales of the game. So here's an article from Kotaku that summarizes this whole post right here from Ubisoft, which describes what's ahead for Ghost Recon Breakpoint. This was posted on March 4th, 2020, and it highlights the elements that they plan for the future of the game in order to improve based on the feedback provided by the community. And this Kotaku article begins talking about how Ubisoft said today that they're canceling Ghost Recon Breakpoint's planned second raid. They're reducing its aggravating always online requirement, and perhaps the most important of all, and the thing that people are looking for to most, an update that lets players deactivate its despised loot system. It is this mode called immersive mode that they announced a while back. Essentially gets rid of the looter shooter element that was kind of shoehorned into Ghost Recon Breakpoint. An element that wasn't put in there because it is actually what's best for the game, but rather because it is what's most monetizable. They were following trends, and they were hoping that by making Ghost Recon into a looter shooter, they'd be able to make money off of it. It's very much a corporate decision. It doesn't particularly feel like a creatively empowered one. And so as far as immersive mode goes, here's a description of that. Guns and armor they picked up after defeating enemies all had stats that contributed to an overall gear score number, referring to the current state of Ghost Recon Breakpoint, which needed to be raised so players could take on tougher missions and enemies. This meant players were constantly ditching and replacing their weapons, having to play the game as if it were Diablo or Destiny, which of course is not the spirit of Ghost Recon. Those who've played the franchise for a while will know that this kind of system doesn't lend itself to the tactical nature. And so what immersive mode does is, quote, players who use immersive mode will be able to pick up a weapon and find it viable throughout their time playing the game. In this mode, gear score is gone. Players who use this mode will also be able to customize settings for their character stamina and health, clear clutter from the game's heads-up display, and even determine whether getting shot always causes severe injury. So immersive mode intends to live up to the name immersive and actually make it less about statistics and more about that tactical military shooter that is at the soul of the Ghost Recon franchise. And the fact that they even went in this direction at all, where they try to make it into a Division 2 style game, is baffling. And not to mention that people already have Division 2. Why do we need another game in that style? Why couldn't they make Ghost Recon its own thing that captures the soul of that franchise? Again, financially driven decisions, not creative ones. And then the article proceeds to talk about how disastrous the past couple of months have been for this game, with Ubisoft having essentially gotten rid of the roadmap. And that's happened a lot in the AAA landscape with live services, where they announce a roadmap and everything just doesn't go as planned. And, they make these promises that they cannot keep. It is the folly of roadmaps. As part of the disruption to the roadmap, Ubisoft revealed that the next raid is canceled. There was a raid that came in the fall, but they're essentially getting rid of the next one so that they can deepen the options for immersive mode, so they can focus on that, because a lot of players ultimately want the base game to be in a solid state before new content is added, because it doesn't matter how much new content there is if the core of the game itself is flawed, if it's something that people don't enjoy playing. So the immersive mode is top priority right now, which I guess does make sense. And then the article proceeds to talk about how year one of the roadmap has seen numerous slips. Invasion of Cinematic Terminator slated for December, slipped to January. Extension of the game's campaign seemingly set for February will now be part of the March 24th update. And also, actually, the immersive mode itself, which was supposed to come out at the end of February, was delayed to March 24th more recently. So it's clear that the team just cannot keep up with their own plans because there's just so much of the game that's flawed and there's so much to fix because the foundation is so broken. And then another major complaint for the game was that it was always online, including any sort of single player modes that don't necessitate for that type of always online system. So with the March 24th update that's upcoming, that's something that Ubisoft will be getting rid of. It's not fully offline. A Ubisoft rep confirmed to Kotaku that players will need to have an online connection to start the game, but at least you won't be booted for a spotty connection. So I guess it's a compromise of sorts. And then finally, there was discussion of how some fans lamented that Breakpoint wouldn't give solo players the option to roam the map with computer-controlled allies, which its predecessor, Ghost Recon Wildlands, had supported. And this is another case of, sequels somehow being a downgrade in a lot of ways from the prequels, whether it's because of development issues, because of corporate mandates, or because they just didn't have the time to implement features that were in the previous game. And it was highlighted that Ubisoft is now promising to add that, though, because it is in the top of their priorities right now. It's coming in the coming months. It's something that should have launched with the game in the first place, but, this is where we're at. This is the AAA landscape we're talking about. It's sad that this is no longer surprising. So yeah, all of that is discussed in this post. And then beyond that, here's a post from October 28th, 2019. This was shortly after the game launched, in which there was discussion of the technical state of the game. The game launched super buggy. Post-launch content, it was lacking in content generally speaking. In-game economy, there were a lot of complaints about the microtransactions. AI teammates, this is what we discussed before, a feature that's missing for no reason, given that the previous game did have this. And then freedom of choice and the conclusion, and them saying, oh, we know we screwed up, but we're working on it. And yeah, it's becoming so tiresome, this whole process of broken launch followed by boilerplate statements and promises. And it's nice when a game does eventually get to an adequate state, but this shouldn't be the trend. This should be the exception rather than the normal state of things. As for in-game economy, well, here's a glimpse of the microtransactions that the game launched with, and I haven't kept up with the game, so I don't know where the microtransactions are at now, but recall that there were a lot of gameplay affecting elements on top of cosmetics. So things like skill points that you could buy, upgrades, and whatnot. And then Ubisoft tried to backpedal by saying, oh, whoops, we added the gameplay affecting stuff by accident. Weird, how'd that get in there? That was supposed to be added later. Even if that excuse were true, it's still a pretty shitty thing to do. But yeah, the microtransactions were awful. And the fact that they had the audacity to launch this when the game was in such a poor state. The microtransactions were working just fine, but the game itself was broken to all hell. The priorities are so off with this game and with Ubisoft as a whole. And here's an article discussing how the immersive mode was delayed. This is an article from 10 days ago, back in February, which caused a lot of people to, be disappointed, but at this point they're figuring, it's better for them to delay it and get this right than rush another thing that ends up being broken at launch. So I guess there's that. And then here's an article from October 25th, 2019, in which the Ubisoft CEO Yves Guillemot did admit that they fucked up thoroughly with Ghost Recon Breakpoint. There's a discussion here about how there's a sharp downward revision in revenues expected from both games, referring to Ghost Recon Breakpoint and The Division 2. Both games underperformed, but Ghost Recon Breakpoint especially, both critically and commercially. And it reads right here how Yves Guillemot blamed on a failure to differentiate Breakpoint from its predecessor, an overall lack of interest in sequels to live services, and excess bugs for the game's failure. This notion that there's not an interest in sequels for live games is completely false. It really depends on what you're presenting to the players. It feels like by buying the sequel, they're really getting something new and substantial, something that builds on a solid foundation, rather than something that feels like it's taking steps back, something that feels like a downgrade, as Breakpoint did. And Breakpoint differentiated itself from its predecessor, the first game, for all the wrong reasons. Again, with the looter-shooter elements and other things that they just sort of downgraded. and it's a buggy mess of a release, and all of these factors contributed to the game not selling as well. Oh, people are generally not interested in sequels. That's an excuse you're giving. The fact remains you failed to create a compelling game that people would love to buy, and something that would garner a lot of positive attention and spread positive word of mouth. That's why this game failed, because you released a substandard product. Here's a quote from Guillermo that specifies what he meant. He said, "We continue to learn and adapt to the realities of live operations, and what we just experienced is that it is more difficult to create interest for a sequel of a successful live multiplayer game when the past iteration has benefited from years of optimization and improvements, but a lot of these AAA games, the sequels release just more broken with less features than the original base game did, just in a worse state. It feels like a regression in a lot of ways. That's where the issue lies. The fact of the matter is that publishers tend to rush towards a sequel release rather than giving these projects the amount of development time that is needed to ensure that it feels like an improvement over the original. This rush towards getting these games out just to meet financial guidance rather than putting them out there when they're absolutely ready. And then he added, with so many learnings and built-in confidence from our teams, we wrongly believe that after a 30 to 36 month gap between releases, players would be ready to enjoy new adventures of our live games. In the end, it proved too short a time frame. 30 to 36 months, I think, is actually a pretty significant gap. And if you can make a proper game in that time, a proper sequel, then go for it. But if not, then don't, and just wait even longer, however long it takes for the game to be as good as it needs to be. Now, Guillermo did admit here that the changes that were brought about to the core gameplay did generate very negative reactions, and that while there were some who enjoyed it, there was a significant portion of the community that rejected the looter-shooter elements that were shoehorned in there. This is what happens when you make corporate decisions in designing gameplay rather than just thinking about what is best for the IP. And then Yves Guillemot even admitted that they knew the game was in a rough technical state and rushed it out anyway, which is thoroughly unacceptable, and therein lies the core issue behind why Breakpoint failed. And then he said, what we see now is that with the response from players, we were wrong in our assumption, referring to the assumption that what they perceived to be small flaws, they were not small at all, were easily outweighed by the overall quality of the co-op campaign. Just pure delusion. Guillemot finally concluded by admitting that they just need more development time for these types of games when they come up with a new iteration. And now it's a matter of them putting to practice what Guillemot is preaching here. We'll see. I mean, it's just, we've seen plenty of game companies, AAA publishers and CEOs promising this and that and not ultimately delivering. We'll see if Guillemot actually enacts the necessary changes. But on that front, we are already seeing some signs that Guillemot might be serious about making dramatic changes within the company. This all began with the delays for Watch Dogs Legion, Rainbow Six Quarantine, and Gods and Monsters, all happening at once after the negative reception and just the bad commercial performance of Breakpoint and Division 2. Ubisoft realized, oh shit, we actually have to make good games and give them the proper breathing room and development time so that they can sell, so that positive word of mouth can spread. And so the hope is that when these games do launch, they'll be in tip-top shape, rather than pull another Ghost Recon Breakpoint, another Rainbow Six Siege, another No Man's Sky. And then here's more recent news from January 2020 that Ubisoft is revamping their editorial team to make its games more unique. They're essentially restructuring their entire creative team within the company to ensure that games are of higher quality, they're more varied, and that they're just more creatively driven. That's what is being reported here, at least. This is an exclusive story from Video Games Chronicle. Fingers crossed that this overhaul pans out. Ubisoft, like many other AAA publishers, they have a treasure trove of franchises, and they could do great things with it if they put their minds to it, if they take the right approach, if they give the developers and creators a level of creative freedom that isn't common enough. Kind of like what Sony does with a lot of their studios. Give them that creative freedom, great things will come from that. You'll get that critical reception. The sales will kind of happen out of the merit of the game and the positive word of mouth that spreads. And you're building a brand name, a franchise that builds and builds and builds. And that's how you really foster success in a way that feels fulfilling and satisfying, rather than taking the how do we gouge players, how do we monetize players, what's the best corporate decision to make as far as monetization for these games goes, how do we make short-term money now and ruin our reputation. But yeah, at least we're hearing of rumblings that Ubisoft is tangibly thinking about how to improve themselves, and hopefully this ends up panning out. So yeah, only time will tell whether Ubisoft gets its shit together or whether old dogs won't learn new tricks, whether they're gonna stubbornly continue with their old ways, whether old habits die hard. Time will tell. In the meantime, let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on the current state of Ghost Recon Breakpoint and what Ubisoft has said about their intentions to essentially overhaul the game with this immersive mode. Do you think there's hope for this title? Do you think you might check it out if the reworking ends up being solid, or have you moved on to other ventures and other live services that are battling for your time? Drop a comment below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.